Thanks very much, Talat. Very glad to be here, friends and comrades. I wanted to talk about this subject because I think it's very relevant to what is going on today. And it's something that needs to be discussed seriously, calmly, without people getting too worked up. And this is a good place to do it. First, I don't think I have to explain to this audience, which I sometimes have to do to less political audiences, that American imperialism actually exists. That this is not a figment of our imagination, this is not dinosaur talk or dinosaur sign language, that this is in fact a reality. And this is a reality, though not often discussed as it should be, is something which dominates the world and determines many of the things going on in it. Now, what we are really witnessing and have been witnessing since the last decades of the last century onwards has been the growing power of the United States, not the decreasing power, the growing power, political, ideological, military, especially in these three domains, of the United States as an imperial state and as a dominant imperial state. And how this has come about, I'm not going to go into too much detail, because this is a process that began with the very foundation of the United States. I mean, liberals and even very radical liberals tend to avoid this. But if you study some of the scholarly work and historical work on the origins of the American empire, the origins begin with the origins of the United States itself. And even the most liberal of the founders of the American state, Jefferson, said, first and foremost, we have to understand that our competitor on the seas is Britain, which is why we need to construct a large navy. So there was no doubt in their minds what they were up to and what they were doing. And even though they first expanded the state internally, i.e. within their own so-called territories, which they'd taken, and began to take large chunks of Mexico, bought Louisiana from the French, had a go at taking Canada, which failed, etc., etc. But this empire became a global empire, or the process became a global process with the First World War, when the American intervention was absolutely necessary in order to maintain some semblance of stability in Europe in the face of an event that was taking place at roughly the same time, which is the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And Lenin's April theses, preparing the revolution and pushing the masses and his own party to take the plunge virtually at the same time. Ironically, but not so ironically and not so coincidentally, because the February Revolution had already happened. No one knew where Russia was going or where it would end up. And at that same time, a small committee of people in Washington was meeting, pushing now for something they had avoided, which was military intervention in the war, effectively to save the British Empire. Initially, there was a lot of debate as to whether even the Americans would go in. They said no in 1914. There was some talk, well, if we're going to even go in, why shouldn't we go in on the German side? After all, large numbers of Americans of German origin lived in the country. But they didn't do that. They finally went in to save Britain. Otherwise, they would have, had the Americans not come in, there would undoubtedly have been a stalemate in the First World War. You wouldn't have, and they would have settled some deal. You wouldn't have had a Treaty of Versailles. And who knows what else we might or might not have had. But the unfolding saga of the Russian Revolution 100 years, or almost 100 years ago, changed all that, changed world politics, and made the American presence on the ground very necessary. That's one point. The second point I want to make very briefly is that within the German Social Democratic Party, a debate had erupted just on the eve of the First World War. The principal theoretician of German social democracy, Karl Kautsky, left social democrat, wrote a document, a little pamphlet called Ultra-Imperialism. This was literally weeks before the war, in which he said there was no danger of inter-imperialist contradictions. These had been sorted out, and effectively what was taking place was the merger of different imperialisms under an ultra-imperialism. He, of course, didn't predict it would be the United States, but he said all the tendencies, economic, political, ideological, are bending in that direction. Of course, I mean, Lenin, always quick on the draw, just wrote a devastating critique of Kautsky's pamphlet in 1916, which actually made the pamphlet, Kautsky's pamphlet, better known later on. But if you look at it, and the First World War dynamited his theses, most of his theses, but what Kautsky had said was that regardless of the current war, because he realized he had to say something about that, the tendencies were still there, and the rising tide of movements in the colonial world and elsewhere would push in that direction. Well, and force the imperialist powers to collaborate. Well, it didn't quite work out in that fashion, but it is true that the huge colonial, anti-colonial movements that erupted after the Russian Revolution in different parts of the world, primarily in the colonies of the European powers, did push them back. And after the Second World War, it took another world war before Kautsky's theses on this particular point were almost vindicated, where he said, where the national liberation movements pushed imperialisms, the European imperialisms, back, and inter-imperialist contradictions, of course, helped in that. The Japanese destroyed the European empires in Asia, and something had to be done after the war. The only way the European empires were maintained after the war was by the United States. In the case, I mean, the British got out of India and subsequently out of Africa, slowly out of the Middle East. The Americans had already, while the war was going on, taken over Saudi Arabia, literally taken it over. I mean, bought it without paying the British, who they should have paid, but they didn't because they were helping Britain in other ways. So they took the, in the Arab world, they took the Saudi state from the British. They took the Vietnamese, Indochinese peninsula from the French and carried on the wars there, as we know, and slowly became a dominant power. And because of the existence of the Soviet Union and the abstract idea of communism associated with it, and very strongly by the imperialists, they decided, and they had no other option, but the end of the Second World War had meant that inter-imperialist contradictions were just out. For one, American troops were present in Japan, Germany, Britain. The French were a broken reed, given that most of them had collaborated with the Germans in the Second World War, silently, and some, of course, openly with the Vichy regime. So the prestige of the United States on the one level was very high, and the resistance of the Red Army against the Nazis in the Soviet Union had given a massive prestige to the communist parties, small, in France and Italy, which became mass parties in the same period. But in terms of imperialism, the enemies they now saw were, of course, the communist world, as it called itself, and the national liberation movements. These were the enemies, and against these enemies, the United States told the junior, its subordinate colonial powers, Britain, France, Belgium, etc., there's no other way, it didn't even need to be said. In 1956, it was made absolutely clear that no independent colonial adventures were to be allowed again. The British and French adventures in Egypt were the last of their kind. From then on, American permission was necessary for anything that was to be done, and they basically determined what was to be done. So I would argue that from 1956 onwards, you saw the beginnings of a process which created an ultra-imperialism, which is the United States of America, the total collapse of the Soviet Union, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Chinese decision to take their own version of capitalism in the way they did, made the United States absolutely dominant. Now, this dominance was exercised through a network of institutions, military, political, economic, the United Nations, NATO, the WTO, the IMF, the European Union. Be foolish to see the European Union as something that sprung up independently of the will of the United States. I mean, it's just utopian and nonsensical, really, to think that. I mean, all the evidence is there. I'm particularly irritated by all this because of the sort of strange atmosphere in London and the Southeast, where younger people somehow think that the European Union was a sort of a dream world, you know, a gold standard which we had to admire non-stop, and you know, no idea whatsoever about how it was created, how it developed, and what it has become. An absolutely monstrous, squalid, corrupt, undemocratic institution. No better or no better or worse than Britain. I'm not saying Britain is better. So the dominance of the United States is unchallenged, and there have been a lot of theories of late, especially in the academic world, but not exclusively, which have argued that the American empire is now on a total decline, and this is, of course, very pleasing, etc., and all sorts of facts are deduced. Quite honestly, I mean, no one would be happier if it was true than me and many of you sitting here. It's just not accurate. So one opposes this point of view not out of any wish to, you know, grind particular axes, but to just because it isn't true, and it disarms people to think that it is true. And the effect of it is to disarm. Whether it's the intention is something else, but the effect is to disarm, because if this is sort of a natural, inevitable process, we don't need to do anything but wait. I mean, or our children and grandchildren will enjoy it. But it isn't like that. Militarily, the United States has never been more dominant in its entire existence as an empire. I printed out a map for you, but you can Google it yourself, the Department of Defense map, which keeps changing as to how many US military bases there are, or they say US military presence, in different continents in the world. It's just astonishing, absolutely astonishing. Just Google it and you'll get a clear picture. That will give you an idea of how the empire has expanded as a military force. Ideologically, it has expanded too. I mean, not just ideologically, but culturally. Its politico-economic line of the form of capitalism we need in the post-90s world has been accepted by and large, even by people who are critical of it for certain reasons of national interest. They've accepted that particular line. American culture is very dominant. There's been a total collapse, virtual collapse of the European independent cinema, which was so powerful in the period immediately, in the decades immediately after the Second World War. The distribution networks, the production networks dominated by the United States, where you see, I just mentioned this as a footnote, where you see some of the finest cinema coming out these days is in the countries which are considered marginal. Iran, Taiwan, South Korea, occasionally China. They produce the films which Europe used to produce immediately after the Second World War, and Eastern Europe too, by the way, despite the domination by the Soviet Union, had a very fine cinema which was quite subversive in its own way. That's more or less gone too. Now, what is the opposition to this empire? Whereas in the past, the opposition to this empire came from the left, communists, sometimes socialists, independents, and the national liberation movements, nationalism. Virtually all the mass movements of this type have ceased to exist. The large mass communist parties, which were in any case careful of what they opposed and what they didn't oppose, depending on what the Soviets' interest was, but nonetheless were a big social force in many European countries, have disappeared, evaporated, become like the worst right-wing social democratic parties used to be. Not the trade unions in every case, but certainly the political parties involved. The left of the communist parties, as we know, with variations, is by and large weak. So in Europe, the opposition comes from anti-war movements, groups of the left like the SWP and others, and this is the same all over Europe. The biggest disaster, in my opinion, has been in the Middle East, where the defeat of what one can call, broadly speaking, a progressive Arab nationalism, and its destruction, its implosion, created a huge vacuum in that part of the world, with the final blow being struck by the Israelis to destroy the Palestinian movement, or the bulk of it, the PLO, with, I hate to say it, but factually accurate, the collaboration of the PLO leadership itself was the last big event in the Middle East, taking place now. You know, it's almost over, but it's been taking place in our lifetime. And to pretend otherwise is not a friendly act to the Palestinian people, because Palestinian solidarity must be with the people of Palestine and not these organizations in any shape or form who have let their own people down and gone on their knees. So the discontents are many, but actually progressive discontent is limited. That is the reality in the Middle East, certainly. I have never known in my entire political life the Middle East to be in such a desolate and desperate state as it is now. And of course, many of us hoped that the Arab Spring would produce something, but you know, it didn't. mean, that's just a fact. With the small left-wing groups who existed in different parts of them, they did very well. I have nothing to say which is critical of them. There was little more they could have done, because the dominant forces in the Middle East over the last decades have essentially been Islamists of one variety or the other. The Islamists who openly collaborate with the United States, the Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the largest organized political force as a political organization in the Middle East. And later the formation of Al-Qaeda, and most recently ISIS, which have filled the vacuum in some ways. It has to be said that probably, though not progressive in a social sense, but at least in an anti-imperialist sense, the only group in the Middle East which has struck some blows which have taken the movement a bit further is Hezbollah in defending its country and its people against the Israelis. They did that. But since the occupation of Iraq, we have seen one disaster after the other. And look, as you know, anyone who's read my stuff knows that I have no time for these, tin pot authoritarian Ba'athist regimes which rule these countries. But it wasn't a choice of being for them or against them as such. It was a choice of who do you defend. And it was difficult to defend the regime. But in the either in the case of Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or Libya, but what we have seen is that the removal, I'm always been in favor of the organic removal of regimes by their own people. It's the best way always that the people of a country take it, and it takes a long time to do it. I mean, when the Americans organized a coup in Indonesia, which led to the death of up to 1 million communists and their fellow travelers and supporters, it didn't occur to anyone on the left, either in the communist left or the non-communist left, to argue that the Chinese should send in the armies, the people's army, into Indonesia to topple the regime. We didn't think like that was the best way to bring about any progressive change, because all these things that happen leave their own mark. And so short-sighted people on the left, who sometimes get so carried away that they feel, okay, if in this case we're taking help from the United States, it doesn't matter. But it does matter, because your aims are very different from them. And what we have seen in Libya, in Iraq, and in Syria is effectively the balkanization of each country, divided into small parts, and ruled either by corrupt warlords or in most cases, by religious fundamentalist groups of one variety or the other. I mean, there was no such group in Iraq prior to the American invasion. And the division between Sunni and Shia, classic imperial operation, which unfortunately works, because divide and rule is not a tactic that is always futile. Occasionally it works. Worked in the Indian subcontinent on a huge way when they were, finally divided it. Worked in Ireland horribly, in Cyprus, in Central Africa. This is a sort of British model. And the Americans, with British help, developed this model in Iraq. I mean, the biggest working class suburb, or not even suburb, central part of Baghdad, built with loving care by its anti-imperialist leaders as a workers' place, more or less ethnically cleansed and handed over to Shia militias. It was a mixed neighborhood. Shia, Sunni, mixtures, Kurds all lived there. What united them was that they were, working class people. And that particular division has created bloodbaths on a horrendous scale in Iraq. Similar things are going on in Syria as we speak, though the Syrian situation now with the intervention of multiple powers is more complicated. But the point I'm making is that the discontents of the American empire have these attributes. One, they have no fixed views. One day they can collaborate with the United States, the next day they can turn against them. They have no progressive vision for the future. It is true that ISIS has taken up this demand of a caliphate, but it's utterly retrograde, because this is a caliphate. This is not the demand of the Arab nationalists of the 50s and 60s, which was unite the Arab world again, an Arab world with 3 concurrent capitals, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. That's all gone. This is now the imposition of a new Wahhabi-style Sunni dictatorship, which also is designed to crush all dissidents within Sunniism, and of course the Shia, who are not even recognized as being part of the faith. They're just absurdities of one sort or the other, and absurdities which serve the needs of local relays of American power. I mean, the ISIS and Al-Qaeda would not exist were it not for Saudi money. That is where it comes from. The 2 big powers in the region now, which are backed by the US, are Saudi Arabia and Israel. And they use them, they're very friendly with each other now, by the way. But they're used by the United States for different things. And the Balkanization of the Arab world is part and parcel of an American project to constantly shore up and reassure the Zionist leadership in Israel. We are working in your interests. The one thing the Israelis haven't got, which they were pushing for, is a similar thing in Iran. And the reason they loathe Obama is because he signed the treaty with Iran, for which, in return for which the Iranians promised not to make nuclear weapons, etc. But had they got Iran, it's not even a secret. The day after Baghdad fell, the Israeli ambassador to the United States said in public, front page of the New York Times, "Congratulations," he said to George Bush, "now finish the job, march on to Damascus and Tehran." But, you know, marching on to the American army thought the guy was crazy. I mean, the Pentagon asked, which world does he live in? You know, we are going to march on and we barely know what to do in Iraq, and he wants us to and the Israelis want us to march on to Damascus and Tehran. It's just crazy. I mean, there are certain people, more these days, the military than on the political side, who question and ask stuff. Now, if in the Arab world there is no progressive, apart from small groups, and this was very noticeable, by the way, in the big movements, that Egypt, which is a country whose dictatorship was shored up by the United States for years, paid billions of dollars each year, second only to the Israelis, to keep the Egyptian army happy. That in the big, I noticed it at the time and said it in Cairo, why were there not a single slogan, or perhaps I exaggerate, maybe there were 1 or 2, or certainly very few bands, criticizing the United States? This for me marked a big shift in mass movements in that part of the world. No attack on the United States and its role. Even when Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, was openly defending Mubarak and saying, you know, we know him, he's a nice man. Why, Bill and I regard him as family. Well, I'm sure you do. That's what she said. That's what she said. And he gave a lot of money to the Clinton Foundation, and I'm sure sooner or later we'll find out to Blair as well. Possibly there was a tip for Sarkozy too, I don't know. But so they used them. But these movements kept politics clear, and you know, this was a big weakness. The thinking not to have politics in the name of unity meant that ultimately the people who did have politics, whether you like it or not, the Brotherhood and its variants, were the ones who dominated. And then they screwed it up, but they were the ones who won in these in these uprisings. So if there is no progressive hostility to the American empire in the Middle East, does it exist anywhere else? Well, it does, but not in huge numbers. The political parties of the left, I mean parties with representations of 5 or 6% in parliaments, are very careful on this question. People don't even like discussing during this big European debates which we've been having recently prior to the referendum. Whenever I raise the question that it's virtually impossible to be a member of the European Union without being a member of NATO, which is a fact, by the way, the Remain people used to get a bit agitated. I mean, the left Remain people. I didn't go near the right-wing ones, but you know, it's something that didn't occur to them. And this is sort of typical of our period, that people get obsessed on a single issue. They don't see it in context. They fail to contextualize it. They don't understand what it really means. And in the case of the EU, and you know, I say this because we've all experienced this, how many people actually know about what is going on in Europe, the Europe which they see with, you know, rose glasses? Everything's lovely. That in virtually every single European country there is a far right, much bigger than here. That it has representation in parliament, including fascists, the open fascists in Greece and Sweden, getting, you know, and some in Germany too, though they're not fascists, they're, you know, extreme right people. I mean, Farage is a bigoted scumbag, we know that. But so is the Prime Minister of France, who comes up with racist statements no different from those of Farage. And he's a member or a leader of the Socialist Party in France. So what is Europe? I mean, it's the sum of its parts, and if the parts are ugly, how can the whole be pretty? I mean, it's not. It's squalid, as we know. In fact, it's worse than its parts, because at least the parts, for whatever other reasons, have democracy of some sort prevailing. So we live in a world which is a world where us, you know, revolutionary movements, etc., have been defeated. The revolutions have been set back. There is a lot to play for and a lot to gain, because it's also a very volatile world. It's not a settled world because of the huge economic crisis. They can't come to grips with it. But here too, I note among some fashionable journalists of the left, this idea that capitalism is also in a bad way, which is true. But that it'll go off, you know, that's fine, we don't need to do too much then. Just, you know, even support it to get more powerful so it implodes. Well, this was not a new idea, actually. It was an idea debated before the Russian Revolution, and I would have thought solved by that revolution, but clearly not, because people are returning to it. A very mechanistic version, if one can call it that, of Marxism. And these ideas, you can read them, you know, in the academy, in the people in the press, anything, but don't organize, don't do anything. Politics is something almost forbidden. I mean, independent politics which says something different, even not something I would say, something a left social democrat would say. And look, that's why the hostility to Corbyn goes so deep. Because he's saying things which no one is used to listening. And even some of the young people who back him are now getting nervous. So this is, it's not a settled world. It's a volatile world, but it's a volatile world in which politics is desperately needed, really so. And we see that, you know, changes come. In Portugal, the left bloc altered its program after some foolish things that they did. Movements are rising. People in Spain realized it couldn't just be an indigenous movement. They formed a party. And, you know, it has good sides and it has weaknesses like everyone else. So it's not that everything is gone, but we have to realize that it's a hard struggle ahead. And this thing, you know, it's all happening everywhere style thing, well, it isn't all happening everywhere. It could happen everywhere, but in order to happen, you need politics, i.e. a program of some sort, for God's sake. That's all.
Hi, I think one of my first comment will be a question to you, which is around the financialization of everyday life and how we can actually stop American empire. The reason why I asked that question is that coming from Africa, when you look at the way in which economy itself is being measured, it's measured on the basis of gross domestic product, which is based on the actual moving of finance from the surplus to the deficit side or deficit to the surplus side. But the reality is that every individual person, whether you are pro or against capitalism, you have some sort of financial security, whether it is mortgage, whether it is credit card, whether it is whatever you name it. And most of the time we don't question where the money comes from that financialize our credit card and our mortgages and things like that. And the reason why I asked that is that in about the time of the colonialization, most of these countries were, developing countries particularly, were conditioned to basically set up a foreign reserve or foreign international reserve. Which means that the surplus you get from your economy, you put it you convert it into foreign currency and you put it in an overseas country. And most of this, we know the bank makes money by not just keeping money in their vault. Basically, they reload the money back into the community. But the interesting thing is that most of the foreign reserve is not kept in places like Africa or South Asia. It's held by the IMF and World Bank, and which is one part of the things that America developed itself. And okay, then the final bit, which is quite interesting, is that IMF then encouraged banks like JP Morgan, RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland to become custodian of this money. And this is the money that comes back to the city of London, and the money then finds its way into other banks, to your mortgages and credit card. So in a way, when you talk about migration and development, we do not necessarily connect finance or everyday finance to how the comfortable life we have now, the privilege we have now, how it actually rub off people from the global south. You know, and I think when you look at the American empire, if you don't understand it, follow the money, basically. And I think we need to start talking about capitalism in terms of finance. And one more thing is that finance do not really anymore obey the law of capitalism we understand. We used to say that you have capital, labor, and land. Now you can just sit down by your computer and just trade money, please. Right? And just trade money, and then you can make so much money without even producing anything. And that's what we need to start thinking again about capitalism.
Thomas will be followed by Nadia Saeed.
I think it's absolutely important to emphasize that since the 1940s, the great achievement of US imperialism was to create a transnational economic and geopolitical space which united pretty much all of the advanced Western capitalist powers under its leadership. And but I do also think it's important to say that there are important strains upon that process that we're seeing playing out today. So during the Cold War, of course, they still had inter-imperialist rivalry with the Soviet Empire, but also since the 60s, the chronic crisis of profitability has meant that the US is facing economic competition. So from the 1960s, Germany and Japan did emerge as economic competitors within that imperialist bloc, even though it doesn't spill over into military competition like around the time of the First World War, for example. The other thing I think is important to say is that there was nothing inevitable that after the Cold War ended, that the US would simply maintain that hegemony. It did take active intervention, particularly within the Balkans, to make sure that NATO and the European Union expanded. So I think there is a contradiction that US imperialism is facing at the moment. That Henry Kissinger, the serial war criminal, was quite right when he said that whilst the US remains the single biggest military superpower, we will face economic competition on a scale that we've never seen before after the Cold War. And you can see that economic competition from competitors both in the likes of China, but also competitors within the space that has been under its leadership. And this means that the US isn't just able to impose what it wants in terms of its imperialist policy as easily as it could do before. One thinks of the Ukraine crisis. Of course, Russia is in no ways as large a military or imperialist power as the US, but the US wasn't simply able to go in and impose its imperialist interests. The fact that there's a proxy war still rumbling on there shows that that US imperialism, certainly on the peripheries of these rising powers, it has been weakened to an extent. And also, if one thinks of just the Brexit vote, I think it's important to say, that has been a blow to the ability of US imperialism to impose some of its interests. The former NATO Supreme Commander in Europe said that we can no longer rely on Britain to be as an effective ally as previously. We're going to have to look towards Germany, but because obviously Germany is also one of its economic competitors, it hasn't been able to rely on it to push its interests within the EU in the same way. That is not going to be as simple for US imperialism. So yes, it's still the biggest threat to peace in the world, it's still the biggest single military superpower, but it is also facing ever-growing contradictions with the increasing economic competition from rivals and also competitors under its own leadership.
Nadia, followed by Charlie Kimber.
All right, well, I just want to really talk about the Arab Spring. You know, I'm a history student right now, and, you know, when the Arab Spring began a few years ago in Tunisia, you know, this was a huge historic moment for me, really, in terms of understanding politics, understanding the way that history and really the conditions in which people can live can change, not by executives, but actually by actions of the people themselves. But another thing that was quite important that I learned was the fact that the issues of a nation or the issues of a people don't die with, you know, one man or even a few men. It doesn't die with Gaddafi, it doesn't go down with Mubarak. You know, it's much wider than that. And I suppose what I'm really referring to here is American imperialism or neo-imperialism, call it what you will. So I suppose my question to you, Tariq, is, you know, we can all recognise that American imperialism is an obstacle to, you know, our kind of liberation and emancipation, at least from America itself. But in terms of removing that obstacle, can that come from the Arab people themselves, or does there need to be a simultaneous dismantling of the American establishment within America and by the American people? Thank you.
Carl, you'll be followed by Amy Leather.
Well, Tariq reminds us quite rightly of the power and the viciousness of the US empire, which no one should gainsay. That it's absolutely clear that if you think about what the Bush regime introduced around the sort of cult of eternal war, that the replacement of Bush by Barack Obama made very little difference in truth. Very little difference to the willingness of US imperialism to use the most barbaric methods against people across the globe. The drone assaults, the murder without trial, the assassinations carried out under Obama mirror very precisely, but by different methods, what Bush wanted to do. But I want to raise two little points of disagreement. One is, I don't think it's quite true to say that the issue of politics is entirely missing from movements across the world. There's actually been a shift around this, if we think about it. There used to be a position, parties are not necessary in order to achieve political change. Actually, amongst much of the left, that's gone now. Syriza was promoted. Podemos was promoted. In America, there's even a resurgence around the US Democratic Party. Now, the question has begun, therefore, not simply about do we need parties in politics, what sort of parties and politics do we need? And this is actually quite an important shift, because it means that people have at least understood that element. The final thing I want to say is about Iraq. Because if you think about what the Project for a New American Century believed it was going to achieve in Iraq, people like Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz and so on, the result has been nothing like they expected. Iraq, I would argue, was a defeat for US imperialism. The appalling results and the emergence of ISIS, which is a result of the US imperial intervention, is not what the Americans hoped to achieve from it. And therefore, it's not completely one-sided about what's going on. That American imperialism remains dominant and brutal, but it certainly isn't true that everywhere it gets exactly what it wants, and in that perhaps lie some seeds of greater hope.
Amy will be followed by Richard Lloyd Barrett.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about how the US has actually used both the carrot and stick policy, really, to extend its influence. Because if you think back to after the Second World War, we often hear talk about the Marshall Plan, how the US gave vast sums of money to rebuild Europe. The truth is, it didn't do it out of the goodness of its heart. It did it very much to extend the influence of its corporations. Nowhere less so, really, than oil, actually. Marshall Plan money went to European states to buy US oil. The thing was, they didn't want them to use US oil produced in the US, because they wanted that for domestic use. And so basically, they had to expand their production in the Middle East. And this completely reshapes Europe's energy use. You know, the US government gives US states money to buy the oil from the US corporations, who basically then subsidise to expand to the Middle East. And Europe shifts very much from coal use to oil, with all the things we've been talking about. But the point is that after the Second World War, the US was able to use that carrot to extend its influence through money, in that way. But actually, I don't think that's so open to it anymore. In fact, I think that it hasn't got the same economic power it had after the Second World War, and actually that's why it's become more and more to try and rely on force in the way that we've seen over the last few decades, trying to extend its influence through might rather than buying it, if you like. But it seems to me as well that, you know, when it tried to extend into Iraq, this was not really what it wanted to do. I remember probably lots of people here at the time in 2003 when we were marching against that war. One of the things then was that they were talking about they wanted to go and bomb Iran and Syria, you know, the axis of evil that they used to talk about. Now actually, back in 2003, they weren't able to go for Iran and Syria. You know, actually they were the mass movements that took place, the setbacks they had in Iraq from the resistance there as well. Now, of course, they come back, don't they? It's not like they never go back. You know, we've seen that with stuff. But, you know, US imperialism does exist, but it's not completely dominant or powerful in the same way. And also, we also understand it as being more complex. Often it's presented, isn't it? It's just the US versus everyone else. Actually, we understand imperialism as being a system of competing states with actually regional and sub-imperialisms as well. But the final thing I wanted to talk about was actually the role of mass movements. Some other people touched on them. Because actually, I think it was crucial that millions of us marched against the war in Iraq and have come out subsequently to march against bombing of Syria. But the legacy continues, doesn't it? Tony Blair cannot escape that. You know, hopefully he's going to, Chilcot will say what we know, that he was a war criminal taking us into that illegal war. But I also thought it was important, those mass movements, because it broke down the dividing line that's tried to set up, that somehow it's East versus West, and that we side with our own governments. Actually, we were against what Bush and Blair did, and we were with the people resisting on the ground. And actually that means that when you talk about resistance movements, it's actually that unity that you can see in that way. But I just want to finish by saying, I totally agree with Tariq. organisation matters in that way, doesn't it? Because it's very crisis-ridden system, very volatile, but we don't just watch. We can intervene, we can help shape that through organising the way that we did to actually prevent further brutal and bloody wars.
To speak, I'm now going to cut speakers to 2 minutes. So Richard will be followed by Baba I.
Okay, real quick. I think Tariq is absolutely right to say that the empire is the enemy, the American empire is the enemy, or for that matter any other aspiring empire like the European empire. It's important to call that as an attempt to get a European empire going. I think he's right to say that it will not collapse under its own contradictions. Trotsky put it very succinctly in 1913 during the Balkans conflict when he said that there's no crisis that capitalism is in that it can't get out of over the broken bones and bodies of the working class. And so he's absolutely right to say that. Blind or foolish, naive optimism is no use to us. And we need to organise, and we have to have a political programme, we have to build parties around those programmes to answer the real questions facing working class people and give something that is viable to people who are alienated, who are resisting, who are downtrodden. But the one qualification I just want to sort of put to all that is to say that there's huge contradictions in the situation facing the empire at the moment, all of the empires, which are opening the space to build those alternatives. And I would just draw the obvious contrast between where we were at in 1989, 1991, with the end of history, the triumph of the sort of neoliberalism, there was no alternatives, all major ideological political debate is over, to where we are now. And this is a huge change. Who would have thought somebody would be seriously contesting for the presidency of the United States who called them a socialist? If you had to call themselves a socialist, whatever we may think about Sanders, what does it represent in terms of the level of alienation with American capitalism? What does, notwithstanding the sellouts of Syriza, what does the level of struggle we have seen in Greece, in Portugal, in Ireland, in Spain, in terms of opening up the space of possibilities for the left? Or even with the, and I agree it is a very bleak situation in the Middle East, but the memory of the Arab Spring has started at least to pull together a new layer of radicals who are open to the ideas of the left. So yes, it's a hard struggle, it's not going to happen on its own, but the capitalism is discrediting itself economically, ideologically, politically, in a way that is opening spaces for the left. And we have to get in and intervene with very sharp politics and with very serious organisation. That's a task, and nothing is inevitable about our victory. But if we do nothing, if we stand paralysed and say what's going to happen, we'll definitely lose. So we have to get organised.
Barbara will be followed by Claire. I haven't got a surname, so I hope Claire knows who she is.
I think the kernel of Tariq's position, he summed it up when he said, there's a lot of discontent, but very limited progressive discontent. And but looking at the whole perspective, I think it has been very rich in the pessimism of the intellect, but it has not adequately found and fanned the embers of optimism of the heart. And really, a number of things said here have pointed that it's not just about the limited nature of progressive alternatives now, but the direction we can see emerging forces interest that seek to go beyond what exists. After 2008, 2009, people have been asking questions. The emergence of a Sanders, a Corbyn, these are not, they didn't just fall from the blue sky. And I mean, the issue of Podemos, you mentioned, even in South Africa, who would have imagined that there will be something to the left of the ANC and that will be gathering force, So I think that it is important not only to see what is now, but to see the bigger picture in terms of, yes, the contradictory nature of it, but that there are forces pushing things forward. And I think that is what is missing in his position. Also, I think that is partly because somehow there's more focus on seeing imperialism in terms of relation between states within this. And I also think that the ideological dimension of the American imperialism wasn't looked at, particularly with regards to the NGOization, because this is one thing that is a major matter to be contended with. I think that is also a bit lacking in this presentation. Thank you.
Claire?
Yeah, that's me.
Claire will be followed by John Molyneux.
Sorry, I didn't think I'd get picked. My heart's going to be going, so just please bear with me. My question was really for you, Tariq, is for me is that the complete silence, or the American propaganda that they've been going in country after country, Latin America, Iraq, and they're going each time under this thing about we're going into restored democracy, weapons of mass destruction, when really it was about oil, regime change, and they could be done under the, a war criminal crime. So my thoughts are at the silence on what's going on with Russia, really, and NATO surrounding all Russia, and John Pilger, what he's talking about, we're coming up to World War III, either with Russia or what the Americans are doing with China at the moment in the South China Seas. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on maybe World War III coming through with the hope that makes sense.
Question. John will be followed by Gary McFarlane, who will be the last speaker in this discussion.
Tariq made, as he always does, a huge number of accurate observations and analyses of the state of the world, of the state of history. And I also agree with, and I think we would all agree, of basically what needs to be done about that, and the need for socialist politics and so on. I just want to try and explain why I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic about our ability to do that than Tariq sounded today. First of all, in terms of objective factors, we've got about 2 minutes, so I have to be very, very brief. But the crisis of the system, which it has no solution to, rooted in the declining rate of profit, is opening up new contradictions all the time. And if, as is likely, there is another recession in the next couple of years, and so on, I think the economic, political and ideological effects of that will be absolutely enormous. What are they going to blame it on? They're not going to be able to blame it on the workers being too militant, are they, and the trade unions and so on. The system will really stand exposed. Secondly, I think the imperialist contradictions are growing, particularly those between the United States and China, which opens up all sorts of possibilities. Thirdly, I think our side, starting with the objective factors, the working class, the size of the working class and its strength, is actually enormously greater than it's ever been in history before. Just think about the Chinese working class and its ability to challenge the system. And the Chinese working class is fighting. It hasn't generalized politically yet, but it is fighting and it is resisting. And that's just the biggest battalion of a working class in India, in Africa, and so on, right around the world, that has never been so big. Then all of these, the economic crisis, the inter-imperialist crisis, the rise of the working class, is also going to interact on roughly the same timescale with the growing crisis over climate change, which will manifest itself in things that immediately affect working class people internationally. This is, of course, this doesn't mean in any sense that the victory of socialism is guaranteed, but it means the whole system is going to be shaken up from top to bottom in ways that give us a serious chance if we organise, if we put forward the kind of programme we're talking about that articulates the interests of working class people and so on. We have a chance in this situation, and the alternative, frankly, doesn't bear thinking about, so we've got to fight.
last speaker. I do apologise to other people who put in speaker slips, but we've just not been able to take them. Gary, 2 minutes.
Yeah, one capitalist commentator remarked that we now have a zombie economy where the capitalists don't invest. We have a zombie market kept alive with quantitative easing, drip feeding from central banks, and zombie politics where you have sit-ins in the Senate and the British Parliament that used to be the strongest in the Western European sphere, but no longer operates. And I think that underlines some of the weakness of the American empire. It's a contradiction where the economy is going down the drain, but they still have a huge military presence. But that presence, they can't exercise it alone. They depend on allies. And I think their defeat in Iraq, we see all over the place, the impact of that. So they haven't been able to bomb Syria. They haven't been able to bomb Syria because we marched on the streets in London and people actually fought back against the war in places like the United States itself. So that does matter. Tariq mentioned their allies, their key allies, like Israel. Israel is the weakest it's ever been. Israel was shocked to its core by the fact that Hamas and the resistance movement had built miles and miles of tunnels that they couldn't destroy. That was they saw that as an existential threat. The key ally, Saudi Arabia, which is now discovering that it can't get its oil at a good enough price, and it's going to talk about selling off bits of it to the capitalist market, to the Western markets, and modernising their economy. They just discovered that actually not allowing women to drive is not very modern. It's actually quite counterproductive from the point of view of capitalism. They have their issues. Egypt, of course, has its issues. Another key ally of the United States of America, and of course Turkey, where the Americans can't work out what to do because they don't want to use the Kurds to support them in their fight against ISIS, but actually they realise that Turkey is a key ally in the region. And just to finish, hearing Tariq today, it would have been so wonderful if we'd heard that argument in the Brexit campaign. In other words, if the Lexit voices were louder and reminded people on the left that actually the European Union is an imperialist power. The European Union and Europeanism is built on the backs of 10,000 dead black people at the bottom of the Mediterranean, and that is all kept going by the United States empire, and people do hate the US empire, but we have to remind them of it. So I think it's excellent, but although I disagree with some of the emphasis that Tariq put, but nevertheless to bend the stick in the direction of pointing people at the real finger, but actually the American empire is not an engine for democracy. The American empire was built on the genocide of the Native Americans, was built on the Atlantic slave trade, and is built on the continuing exploitation of its own people, the working people at home. And as you can see, politically, the working people at home are starting to think about socialism.
There were lots of questions and comments. I'm not going to deal with the ones I agree with, which were quite a few. So, but just to answer this question at the beginning, it often happens that I sound pessimistic, but that is not the case, because when you point out the problems that exist, and when you point out that the enemy is really still quite strong, it's not to indicate that we can't do anything or we should sit on our backsides. In fact, when the British establishment lost the referendum, or the bulk of the British establishment, on Europe, I couldn't resist putting up on my Facebook page a quote from Chairman Mao, which went like this: "There is great disorder under the heavens, the situation is excellent." And so that is in general my feeling at the moment, by the way, which is why I spend so much time traveling all over the world and speaking to meetings, to talking with activists, participating in events, etc. Were I pessimistic, I would not do that, but just sit down and write novels. But so have no doubt about that. I'm not by nature a pessimistic person, but what irritates me sometimes is an over-optimism that emerges of the intellect. The will can be as optimistic as ever, but when the intellect becomes too optimistic, and I've known this even in the 60s and 70s and 80s, often we reach wrong conclusions and misjudge the situation. Okay, so in terms of the American empire, is it strong or weak? It's politically strong, it's ideologically strong, it's militarily strong. Economically, obviously, inside the United States, it's weaker than it was before. I don't dispute that at all. And there's no doubt that the shift that has taken place in the world market, which has made China the single most important player and which has effectively shifted the center of the world market eastwards, is going to have an impact. I mean, there's no doubt. As to what impact it will have remains to be seen. I mean, you have to hire 5 detective agencies to really find out what Chinese foreign policy is. It's the one subject on which there is no discussion in China, in public. In public. Obviously, they talk about these things outside. And I agree very much with John Molyneux that the increase in the size of the proletariat is quite astounding. In fact, I was asked a question at a talk I was giving in Wisconsin a few years ago. Someone just stood up and said, "What's happened to the American working class, Tariq?" And I said, "It's in China." I mean, it's shifted. And don't think that there won't be an impact on that working class. So what is happening as to whether empires, look, go back to the history of empires, it's not that they don't suffer setbacks. Obviously they do. I mean, if you look at the history of the British Empire, at its peak, there was not a single day, I'm not exaggerating, where there wasn't some action, big or small, in the British Empire against it. Not a single day. So obviously, who's arguing that to say that the empire is strong doesn't mean it has no setbacks or doesn't suffer them or doesn't make mistakes? Obviously they do. The American establishment, the military political establishment, was deeply split on whether to stay or get out of Afghanistan. We know that. It was a public debate with some American generals saying, out. Don't send in the 20,000 more troops that Obama did to Afghanistan in order to keep that country from completely collapsing. In Iraq, all this talk about democracy was bullshit. I mean, we know that. I mean, how the hell were they going to do it? I mean, their idea of democracy is implanting a few businessmen from some American state from that region and making them prime ministers, as they do in Europe. You know, the number of technocrats who were made prime ministers of Italy and Spain and other places by the European Union bureaucracy is legion. That is their idea of democracy. I mean, the last guy they found to be the first prime minister of so-called independent, free Libya was a guy who could barely speak who they found in Texas. He was of Libyan origin. And they brought him in and made him prime minister. So that is as far as democracy goes. And by and large, the Americans always prefer to rule through local relays. That is the big difference. And that is where British right-wing historians like Niall Ferguson attack them, saying you have to learn from us. Yeah, but if you learn from the British Empire, you then send in Americans to run these countries, which they're not going to do. They're not that dumb. I mean, they know that there's been wars of national liberation, which means something, and they can't carry on in that way. And they rarely have. I mean, there are a few examples in history. The Philippines was one. They keep bases and troops there, which they do. The big thing for the United States today is not the size of a country, but whether it's willing to kowtow or not. That is the big thing for them. So what they are not in favor of is sovereignty. And Russia was fine under Gorbachev, or under Yeltsin mainly, who in a sort of drunken stupor agreed to every single concession they wanted, economically or politically. But they are not happy with Putin, not because Putin is progressive, he's a deeply conservative figure, but because he defends Russian national interests. Sovereignty. They're not prepared to tolerate that. And this is what is irritating them at the present time. It's not that Russia poses an economic threat to the United States, it's resisting its will. It's resisting the imperial will. And that's another question altogether. I've been told I have to wind up, so I can't deal with... I agree with the comrade who spoke about the Arab Spring, and to answer her question, I think the struggle against imperialism, or a victory against imperialism in a meaningful sense of the word, can only be a combined victory, outside and inside, without any doubt. And one more point I want to make. When I talked about a refusal to accept the autonomy of politics, I was referring not so much, obviously, to the more recent developments, but a big trend in intellectual thought in Europe and in North America, which underplays politics. So the Marx is very fashionable. Fine. We can read him, we can worship him, we can discuss him. It's accepted. And the right use Marx to, out of context, and say he favored capitalism and the growth of capitalism, which lots of former Marxists involved in governments of one sort or the other do. The figure who's deeply unfashionable is a figure who made Marx possible, and that's Lenin. And they don't like Lenin because Lenin poses questions that are awkward. What is the ruling class? How does it rule? How can it be changed? What is going to happen? So I agree. I think it was John who said that the shift amongst the former occupiers of squares to politics is very welcome. I've spoken for them in different parts of the States and here and in Europe. It's tremendous. But we face, immediately we come up with questions. And the question in the States is this: okay, he tried to take the Democratic nomination. He's not going to get it. He did a very good job. He popularized the word socialism. Lots of people are reading books about it, etc. But what now? What now? It's obvious what we need now in the United States is there's millions of people mobilized to get a more progressive candidate in to the Democratic Party. Ideally, if Bernie was to announce a new movement or a new party that was organized totally in favor, he would be attacked, but is he going to do it? I don't think so. I'll be very happy if he does. Likewise here. Let's say we lose, Jeremy loses. I don't think he will lose the election for the leadership. I don't think he will. But what then? You then will have a clear split, a de facto split. The Labour Party, and backed by the unions, a Save Labour group in Parliament, which is all these rotten Blairites, who would be much happier in the Conservative Party, a and so there will be a big opening in that case. And how we intervene then becomes extremely important. The other, if you just bear with me for one minute, the point which is worth understanding is sometimes electoral rules and laws actually prevent politics, which is why the demand for proportional representation is extremely important. And I've argued this case, and people say, but the UKIP got 3.8 million votes, and that means they would have had 100 MPs. Well, so be it. That's, it opens up the space. You fight them then. And you fight for your own. You can't resist it simply by pretending they don't exist. That's why the left has got representation in the Irish Parliament. That is why the left gets representation elsewhere in Europe. That's why the Scots got representation in the Scottish Parliament. So we have to fight for all these demands. because they take the whole movement forward. And there will be many opportunities in the coming years. So don't think I'm pessimistic. I'm optimistic, but I'm just saying let's not be so optimistic that we lose sight of reality.